So, it's really crossed the line into the dark, shadowy world of like gangsterism and revolution, or conspiratia. Yeah. So he's very nearly arrested. The state starts clamping down on everything they can in like 1902, 1903. The Tsarist regime realises that there's just places all around the Russian Empire, as it was then, including places like Georgia, were just riddled with discontent and revolutionary parties. So they try to actually start stamping it out, and hundreds of people around Stalin are arrested. I'm talking about over a period of months and a couple of years here, but Stalin helps lead a jailbreak. I can't find a great deal of detail about that, but apparently there was a jailbreak which Stalin helped lead, from the front as well, standing up to the actual Cossacks. Cossacks were armed soldiers, Russian armed soldiers, like quite often mounted, and would have big long sabres, or maybe even a lance. Or sometimes they say the Cossacks of this period had whips, like a really heavy like bull whip. If they're up on a horse, it's a long bull whip, and like that could kill you. And yeah, so Cossacks are again your enemy. You're looking at it from Stalin's point of view. They're like the enemy of the people, if you like. They're like one of the Tsar's tools of oppression. And so they had a bit of a running fight with some Cossacks, and quite a few people died, like about 13 people died in this attempted or semi-successful jailbreak. And Stalin obviously survived and was jubilant, apparently, at this. He said, yeah, we lost a few people, but we made a point. The Cossacks know we're not fucking about. But there you can see, trying to get into the mind of someone that ended up doing the stuff that Stalin did, the real mass, millions of people getting killed. That even there, 13 people, he just basically got 13 people killed, and he's happy. We proved a point, or we've made a statement of some kind. The fact that 13 people died doesn't really matter. So, a cold fish, cold character. So, yeah, over this period, Stalin begins ordering more and more killings of people, mainly people that he thinks are spies within their own ranks, or just local officials that are just, he just can't stand them, that he has to have them. And sometimes they fail. They're not, because this outfit of his is not really, really, really professional. It's not like a KGB or NKVD outfit where they're like military trained or anything. They're just local street hoodlums, murderous street hoodlums. But eventually he's hardcore hunted by the Okhrana, and he is finally arrested, and they put him in Batumi jail, and he just immediately becomes the kingpin of that jail, like straight away. Just he's the daddy now on that wing. And basically, apparently, just run stuff from jail. You know how, some mafioso gangster leaders, you put them in jail, but they still just live the high life as much as they can in jail, and still just giving out their orders to their quislings and just still being the boss, really. Well, that's apparently what Stalin did when he was in jail in Batumi. About this time, Lenin writes an essay called What Is to Be Done, and apparently this essay was seminal, and everyone that knew Lenin or knew the Bolsheviks or the socialist movement, was remotely in the scene, would have got a copy of this essay, What Is to Be Done. And Stalin did. Stalin still hasn't met Lenin at this point. He's never met him. Lenin almost certainly has never heard of Stalin, probably by this point. Lenin is the famous leader abroad, and Stalin's just a Georgian desperado who's like high up in the local party. But so anyway, and Stalin, along with nearly everyone else that read it, claimed that it was brilliant, and that they were even more devoted to sort of Lenin and the Bolsheviks than ever before. And even many years later, people mentioned this particular essay as having turned them. And part of the essay is calling for people like Stalin, calling for like people with no real scruples. He was saying, look, what we need, if we're ever going to make this revolution happen, if we're ever going to fight back against the murderous secret police of the Tsars, we've got to get serious, we've got to get bloody. So you can imagine, for someone like So-So, Older Yugashili, it's like music to his ears. It's like, well, that's me. I'm your man. I can't wait till we meet because, I'm what you're looking for, apparently, if the essay is to be believed. But the authorities know the deal. They know what they're dealing with. That he's the real deal. He's not mucking about. So they move him to a harder prison, a more difficult prison where he can't necessarily be still running stuff. They crack down on him a bit because they can't get him on any real murders. They just know that he's the leader of a banned party. So the sentence he actually ends up getting is 3 years in exile. Not just hanging. One of the things about the Tsarist regime is that they didn't actually execute that many people. If you killed a local official, then you'd probably get executed. But if you were just a member of a banned party, for example, you probably wouldn't ever get executed. But what he got was 3 years in exile. Yeah, and they tried to get him on that massacre where the Cossacks killed 13 people and some Cossacks themselves got killed. They tried, but they couldn't. See, he's clever. He keeps himself at least one removed from the actual violence and the killing quite often, like a real mafioso. An actual godfather would hardly ever kill anyone himself. You don't do that. Kind of wily. He's certainly not inept at what he's doing, but they do send him away. And something I've got to say about these exiles, because loads of these guys, these early Bolsheviks and Mensheviks and others, a lot of the time they get sentenced to exile. Now, what that means is that you're sent somewhere else a long way away within the Russian Empire, usually Siberia. And you're not put in a prison when you get there. The fact is, you're so far away, like it could take weeks to get from sort of Western Russia, places like St. Petersburg, Moscow, or, even places like Georgia or Baku. If they send you out to sort of Eastern Siberia, that could, you're almost on the other side of the world. That in itself is a punishment. Now, when you're out there, you're probably just kept in a relatively small, really remote village, and there'll be like a police station there, but you just stay in a normal house, and the police don't keep you under constant surveillance or anything. And there's probably like a small group of you, all like exiles from Moscow or something. And in some ways, it's kind of pleasant. I mean, it's cold, of course, but not necessarily. I mean, there's Siberian and there's real Siberia, and usually not sent to the really, really, really cold places. And I've heard it described lots of times described as like a reading holiday. These revolutionaries would use their sentence of a few years in exile to sort of become a better red Marxist. And they would just, stay up late drinking and, fornicating loads, apparently, and falling out with each other. And, lots of drinking and just like reading and just sort of taking it easy. And you could escape. I say escape in inverted commas because you're not under full surveillance. You're not kept in a cell or anything like that. So you could escape whenever you wanted, and loads did. But the thing is, how are you going to escape? Because, like I say, you're weeks by train away from anywhere, certainly away from where you come from. And if you were going to try and get out by sled or by horse or by foot, I mean, you're in a real survival situation straight away. You're in the middle of nowhere. They're like areas that are the size of Western Europe, and there's like 3 small hamlets there. One time I heard one describe where because Stalin gets sent to exile, I think 6 times, and he escapes, I think, all but once or twice. And one time they sent him somewhere, and it said the area was the size of the square area was the size of Britain, France, and Germany combined, and there was only 12,000 people in that whole area, and they were only sort of like reindeer farmers, like I say, the odd little hamlet with peasants in eking out a living. That is the punishment, that you're so far away from anything. So anyway, the first time Stalin gets sent on to exile, he gets sent to Siberia, but it's not real Siberia, and he kind of enjoys it. He again, he's a bit promiscuous, and a lot of the women or a lot of the family he stays with, either the landlady or if there's a good looking daughter, he sort of shacks up with them before too long. Actually, on the first time he does go out to Siberia, they shackled him, put shackles on him, which they didn't usually do that sort of thing too much. And he said, or he was quoted much later in life saying, I'm paraphrasing here, but saying something along the lines of, you can never know the relief of what it's like to have shackles taken off. And again, if that's something that's stuck with you for, 20, 30 years, you can imagine it made an indelible mark on his psyche in some way. This is a guy that's already brutalised, had a really brutal childhood, and then plunged into a world of murder and brutality, and then thrown into a prison, sort of, certainly exiled, taken out of any comfort zone he might have had, and shackled. This is like, it's hard not to think of him as a dog that's been beat. In a way, it's like, no wonder he was a heartless son of a bitch when he got the reins of power, when he finally could call all the shots. Yeah, he was ruthless and just had no compassion, zero compassion. As I mentioned, even for people in his own family. I mean, here's one example. He had a son. We'll get onto later his son, but his first son he had with his first wife. He didn't see him for like 10 years. And then when he did visit him, was just really cold towards him. And then during World War II, when this boy, Yakov, was a grown man and was in the Russian army as a minor officer, he got captured by the Germans in the first few months of the war and was in German captivity. And at one point, or after the Battle of Stalingrad, eventually the Russians won and they surrounded loads and loads of Germans, tens of thousands of Germans, and took the Field Marshal von Paulus prisoner. And that was the highest ranking prisoner you could get, a Field Marshal. Short of Hitler, you don't get, or Hess maybe, you don't get any higher than a Field Marshal. And the Nazis were like, look, give us back von Paulus and we'll give you back Yakov Dukashvili, your boy. And Stalin was like, no. Apparently he thought about it. The account goes that Stalin's men came to him with the offer and he sat back and actually thought about it for a few minutes and then just said, no, it's not a fair exchange. We're not going to swap a minor officer for a Field Marshal. And that was it. And and a bit later in the war, Stalin's son tried to escape and was just gunned down on the barbed wire. And there's a picture, fairly famous picture, I suppose, of a dead guy laying across some barbed wire, and that was Stalin's first son. And Stalin didn't particularly seem to care. There's no accounts of him sort of mourning the loss or anything like that. I mean, you can imagine he may well have been a bit cut up about it, but it doesn't seem to be. So anyway, the guy's cold as ice. There's another couple of little anecdotes from this first time in Siberia. At one point he sees that an amputation is going on, and Stalin later says, in the 30s, recalls it and says he couldn't bear to watch it. It was just too disgusting for him. And again, that's an interesting insight, isn't it? Because he was happy to order the deaths of many people, even really horrible deaths as well, but he didn't want to see it himself. He didn't want to do it himself. That account actually reminds me of one of Hemler, the head of the SS, who was obviously in charge of the Holocaust. There's an account of him seeing some executions, some Jews just getting shot in the head at mass graves somewhere, and some blood and brain matter splattered on him, and he nearly passed out. He nearly threw up and passed out, and he had to retire and was just couldn't handle it, and it really screwed with him. So it's interesting to see that you can be. It's possible to have a mind that is, with the stroke of a pen, will have thousands or millions of people killed, and yet you're very squeamish about the actual reality of brutal violence. It seems Stalin was. Yeah, it seems to be he was in that category. But he's still a scrapper, he's still a fighter. It seems like he was very opinionated. Like he would never hold back in an argument, in anything. There's accounts of his mum, KK, being the same way, that she was very, very, very sarcastic and would put you down for anything at all times. And if there was people talking about things and she had an opinion, she would just say it, regardless of how jarring it might be or anything. And apparently Stalin was the same way. And so on these exiles, these reading trips, it would quite often be the exiles talking amongst each other, arguing about points, and he would just really quite opinionated. At one point, he actually gets knocked out and some ribs broken in an argument in a fight. Apparently, it was over nothing as well. It was over some tobacco or something. But some guy, we all know guys that are a bit aggro. It's for whatever reason, over any tiny little thing, they think it's a matter of principle and they won't back down. So you can end up getting in a real knockdown fist fight over some tobacco. Well, guys with massive egos. I mean, it seems Stalin just did have a lot of arrogance. A lot of people said that about him, that he was really overbearingly arrogant in many ways. In 1903, he gets another pamphlet written by Lenin, and he really loves it, and he's even more enthralled with Lenin than ever before. And he goes on record as saying that in Lenin, this is a quote, "In Lenin, the party has a mountain eagle," end quote. He calls him their mountain eagle. That's how much he loves him. But Stalin even tries to actually escape from this first sojourn into Siberia, but he does it in a really amateurish way. He just gets a few provisions together and tries to head out on foot, just walk back. It's thousands of miles or whatever. And he doesn't make it. He gets frostbite, minor frostbite, doesn't lose fingers or toes or anything, but he gets a tiny little bit of frostbite in his nose and fingers and stuff. And this episode gets more and more fantastic over the years when he tells it. It gets more and more extreme, and the frostbite he suffered gets more and more over the top. But it seems it was, again, like I said earlier, there's loads of times when he could have died. Loads of times. This is another one. By rights, he probably should have died of exposure, attempting that. And it seems like he came really close to dying of exposure, but didn't. He comes back, he gets nursed to health and tries again. He eventually gets back to, by 1904, he does get back to Tiflis, where, there's all his old buddies there. This Carmo, the nutter, he's got the outfit there. He's like the returning Don, in a way. But by this time, Russia is now at war with Japan. And remember, they're Georgians, so they're on the Russian side, they're part of the Russian Empire, but they kind of don't want Russia to win or do well. They kind of hate Russia as well. So it's a bit of a complicated thing. That war doesn't go that well for Russia at all. I mean, to cut to the chase, in the end of that war, there's a peace settlement where the Russians are forced to sign a treaty which is not really in their interests. They're not completely defeated or anywhere near it by the Japanese, but in that limited war, if you like, the Japanese get the upper hand. But anyway, for the next few years, that is sort of the background to what's going on, that there is this war between Russia and Japan. So Russia might not necessarily, one of the main upshots of that is that the Russian Empire hasn't necessarily got as many men like Cossacks or even money and resources to be dealing with all the revolution that's going on all over the place, because they're fighting a proper war. It's not like a World War I or World War II total war or anything like that, but it's a real war. Their whole navy is engaged and stuff. So around this time as well, Stalin starts getting at odds with the party elite. He's sort of got his own ideas about things, and the party elite are sort of hardline. Whatever Lenin says, whatever Lenin writes in his latest pamphlet or essay, that's the line. But Stalin has sort of got his own mind a little bit, and whilst he idolises Lenin and agrees with nearly everything he writes, he still thinks, oh no, this little bit here, I won't go into details because it's boring politics stuff really, just arguing about points of Marxism and things, but even from the beginning, Stalin isn't a complete sycophant for Lenin. He does have his own ideas, at least on small points, but people try and get him to repent rather. People try and get him to try and see, in inverted commas, the error of his ways. Are you sure you don't agree with everything Lenin says? There's a guy called I'm going to have to, unfortunately, mention a few other of these early communists that were really important. One of them's a guy called Kamenev, and I mean, by the time the Russian Revolution actually happens in 1917, the big dogs are Lenin, Stalin, Trotsky, who doesn't come into this story for a while yet. A guy called Zinoviev, a guy called Kamenev, a guy called Bukharin, a guy called Molotov. There's more, there's loads more. But they're basically the main guys, especially ones I'm going to mention, really. It's one of the things, like people always trying to outdo each other if they're like got a few history buffs together in like a dinner party. You know, I've had that more than once where they mention more and more obscure guys from the Russian Revolution, and you're like, really, like saying like you're expected to know who they are and what they did and stuff. It's a bit pretentious. But they're the main guys, like Zinoviev, Kamenev. So yeah, this one guy, Kamenev, was like a leading light. He was a bit more sort of senior and a bit more closer to Lenin and a bit older than Stalin, and he patronised Stalin from the beginning. Like if he didn't know every tiny little nuance of Marxist thought, it would be Kamenev that sort of like put him right in a patronising way, and Stalin never forgave him for it. As I mentioned earlier, anyone that ever got close to Comrade Soso eventually paid the price. So all throughout this story, if there's anyone that you're like, they wronged him in any minor way, you know what ended up happening to them. Even his closest friends. One of his closest friends was this guy called Bukharin. He ended up having him killed. There's this one family called the Aliyuliev family that Stalin stays with lots all throughout his life. In fact, even into the 20s and 30s, he would still sort of visit them or have them visit him and things. And, he slept with some of the female members of the family. But they would help him out and hide him sometimes. Quite often their house was his secret hideout, basically, or his bolt hole was quite often their house. So this family do crop up from time to time. And even when he was out in Siberia, sometimes they would send him care packages and things. So I mentioned earlier there was his personal cutthroat, Karmo. Now, Karmo also had a guy directly under him called Sergo. And anyway, Karmo and Sergo would go around doing the most violent stuff. Like, they're basically, this period in like 1904 is when it starts to really sort of get out of control, I'd say. Karmo, Sergo and Stalin, Comrade Soso, they start really just doing all sorts of stuff all the time. Bank robberies. I've got a fair bit of bank robberies and bumping off people and just doing all sorts of murky stuff, being involved maybe with the police and the secret police and doing double deals and double crossing other people and setting stuff up and, smoke and mirrors stuff. It starts getting really complicated. But what we do know is that they're just up to their necks in it, really. The war keeps going bad for Russia, the Japanese war, and rebellion is just rife in the Caucasus at this point. So the whole area, even more than Georgia, the whole area is just, it seems like everyone's rising up. Because what happens again, just to cut to the chase a bit, in 1905, the following year, there is a revolution in the whole Russian Empire. And it comes extremely close to toppling the whole Russian regime. What eventually happens in 1917 when the Tsar is deposed and eventually executed, that very nearly happens in 1905. So in 1904, which is what I'm talking about right now, it's the run up to that. It's all starting to happen. Just like loads and loads of officials are getting murdered, like thousands of officials over months, are getting murdered by all sorts of different rebellious factions. So it seems like lawless. It's becoming real lawless. The actual rule of law is breaking down. And now Stalin, or people like Stalin at this, thrive on that. That's brilliant. I mean, of course he's living a dangerous life. He could get whacked out at any minute, but if and when he does, of course we know he doesn't. If he doesn't get whacked out, he's just like a pig in shit. He couldn't be happier. He's like a puppet master in a world where suddenly puppet masters are demigods. And he's the head of this outfit. So he's, if you like, learning how to really lead, how to control extremely violent men, psychopaths, how to bend them to his will, get them to be absolutely loyal to him. That's what he ends up doing in Soviet Russia when he gets to the Kremlin decades later. He does it on a huge scale. And I guess he's learning it here. And it's about this time, from doing all this stuff, increasingly criminal and dangerous and higher profile stuff, that Lenin, apparently for the first time, hears of this Korba and likes the sound of him, thinks that he's the sort of nutter he needs. But they still haven't met or anything. at the very beginning of 1905, this is a little anecdote I wanted to say about, because he does something which sounds to me very much like a modern sort of socialist protest that they might do at Berkeley against Ben Shapiro or something. There was a thing called the Banquet Campaign, that sort of rich liberal people in Georgia would just have like a pay-for banquet dinner, very sort of civilised and bourgeois. You know, really quite a middle-class thing to sit down and have a banquet where they would sort of try and raise awareness for their liberal parties and things. And Stalin and a load of agitators and some members of the outfit just bust in and just like insist to speak, and just like singing and shouting and being rowdy. And they're told like, no, like go away. And they're like, oh, fuck this, and start like smashing it up a little bit and just start singing Le Marseillaise and leave. But that's interesting because, you know, it's like a contradiction. He's both a gangster kingpin murderer and a guy that writes kind of highbrow political philosophy articles, and like a sort of churlish student type protester all at once. That's one of the things that lots of historians have said about Stalin and other people like Mao and Hitler, that they're like a bundle of contradictions. They're not always necessarily completely uniform in what they do and say. And you think that Stalin by this point might be a bit beyond that sort of thing, but it seems not. And the war starts going really quite badly for Russia. In fact, their fleet gets defeated by the Japanese fleet, and the whole admiral of the entire Russian fleet gets captured, and that's just a massive humiliation. And they have to, as I say, eventually now sign a treaty that's not really in their favour. There's with the people rising up more and more. There's a Bloody Sunday at this point. You know, there's been loads of Bloody Sundays throughout history. The one in Ireland with the paratroopers, that's just one of many, many Bloody Sundays. If you go on Wikipedia, there'll be like a disambiguation, and there'll be loads. And there was one particular Bloody Sunday here where a load of workers rose up to just try and seize control, and were just shot by the troops, some Cossacks, a few dozen, or I can't remember, 50 or 100 odd. So it's like pretty bad, it's a massacre. And apparently that was like the real catalyst for the 1905 revolution. Like people were like, oh, that's it, that's enough, that's a line in the sand. And that, apparently sort of really kicked stuff off. And of course, in Stalin's articles and things, he was writing in his underground papers, use that event, that Bloody Sunday, to sort of try and kick things off as much as possible, to agitate for revolution. It's basically the end game. Like at this time, let's be absolutely clear, their end game is to get rid of the Tsar. That's it. They're not necessarily thinking, oh, we will then make a Bolshevik government, and that is all way, way, way in the future.